My husband told me he was leaving for a tropical getaway, but he actually left me with a shattered leg and a secret that would eventually trigger a global manhunt. I didn't want a divorce. I wanted to systematically dismantle the entire organized scheme he had been running behind my back. I remember the sterile scent of the hospital room more vividly than I remember the accident itself. The beeping of the monitors was a rhythmic, mocking metronome that counted down the seconds of my isolation. My leg was shattered, held together by titanium pins and the false hope the surgeons kept feeding me, but the real damage wasn't in my bone density, it was in the emptiness of the chair beside my bed. Mark had been the one driving. He had been the one laughing at some joke I can't even recall, distracted for a split second by a notification on his phone before the world folded in on itself. When I woke up 3 days later, the nurse told me he had checked himself out. She looked at me with that pitying expression that made my skin crawl. He hadn't just left, he had packed his bags for a 2-week tropical getaway to the Maldives, a trip we had planned together for our anniversary. He left me a note, a crumpled, hurried piece of stationery, apologizing for the inconvenience and promising to make it up to me once he returned, tanned and refreshed. He didn't even leave money for the copay. The anger didn't come immediately. It was a cold, slow-burning realization that crystallized as I stared at the beige wall of my recovery room. Mark had always been the golden boy, the guy who charmed his way out of every disaster. He was a master of the organized scheme, always juggling side hustles that he claimed were just business networking. I had been so blinded by his charisma that I never looked too closely at the clients he met in dark parking lots or the locked briefcase he kept in the trunk of his car, the one he claimed held sensitive company documents. While he was posting photos of turquoise waters and bottomless mimosas to his social media, I was relearning how to walk. My phone became my only weapon. I didn't reach out to him, even though my thumb hovered over his contact photo 1,000 times. Instead, I started digging. I accessed the cloud account we shared, pretending to look for travel documents, but instead, I started uncovering the digital paper trail of his side business. It wasn't just a simple hustle, it was a web of illegal transactions involving restricted logistics and, more alarmingly, the distribution of packages with substances that would land him an enormous sentence if ever caught. He was arrogant. He thought that because he was charming, he was untouchable. He had stored everything, the ledgers, the addresses, the photos of the merchandise, in a folder labeled Travel Pics. He was practically daring someone to look. By the second week of his vacation, I had compiled enough evidence to make even the most seasoned detective blush. I didn't want a divorce settlement. I wanted a total collapse. I contacted the Service of Internal Security, framing my tip as a concerned citizen who had stumbled upon a dangerous operation. I provided timestamps, locations, and the specific codes he used to track his inventory. I even dropped a hint about the illegal weapon he kept stashed at our apartment, a piece he'd bragged about owning, thinking it made him look powerful rather than just pathetic. On the day he was supposed to board his flight back to the country, I was sitting in my living room, my crutches leaning against the sofa. I had canceled his credit cards, drained the joint account for my medical bills, and moved his belongings into the hallway. I felt a strange, electric anticipation. I tracked his flight, knowing exactly when he would touch down, and more importantly, when the authorities would be waiting at the arrivals gate. He walked through the sliding doors of the airport, looking bronzed, relaxed, and utterly oblivious. He was checking his phone, perhaps looking for a message from me, waiting for me to be the submissive, forgiving partner he expected me to be. He caught sight of me sitting in the arrivals lounge. His face didn't soften, it twisted into a mask of pure annoyance. He marched toward me, his designer suitcase rolling loudly on the tile floor, ready to reprimand me for not picking him up. "Are you serious, Sarah?" he snapped, looming over me. "You're making a scene? I told you I'd deal with the hospital stuff when I got back. You look pathetic sitting there like a charity case." I didn't blink. I didn't defend myself. I just pulled my phone out and tilted the screen toward him. It was a live feed of the officers currently surrounding his car back at our apartment, and a notification from the Internal Security Service confirming that his passport had been flagged for an immediate hold due to a pending warrant involving an attempted life-ruining charge. He stopped mid-sentence. The color drained from his face so rapidly, it looked like he was losing oxygen. He looked around, seeing the plainclothes agents slowly emerging from the crowd, their eyes locked onto him with the clinical, predatory focus of men who knew exactly who they were hunting. Mark dropped his suitcase, his hands trembling as the realization hit him, not just that his vacation was over, but that his entire existence as he knew it had been systematically dismantled while he was sipping cocktails by the beach. He reached out to grab my arm, desperation flickering in his eyes, but a heavy hand landed on his shoulder, spinning him around. As they pressed him against the glass wall of the terminal, the last thing he saw before the handcuffs clicked shut was me, calmly picking up my crutches and turning to walk toward the exit, finally free from the weight of him. But as I reached the doors, my phone buzzed with an anonymous text that stopped me dead in my tracks. "You think you're safe now, but you just opened a door you can never close." The message blinked on my screen, glowing like an ember in the dark, and for a heartbeat, my breath hitched in my throat. I looked back at the glass wall of the terminal, but the crowd had already swallowed the spectacle of Mark's arrest. He was gone, led toward a service exit by men in suits who didn't look like standard police officers. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt the weight of my caste and the lingering pain in my hip dissolve in the face of sweet, cold justice. Instead, a phantom chill crawled up my spine, the kind that whispers that you aren't the hunter, but the prey. I didn't wait for a taxi. I limped toward the parking garage, my ears ringing with the phantom sounds of airport security alarms. Every passing shadow seemed to stretch toward me, and the rhythmic thud-drag-thud of my crutches on the concrete floor sounded like a countdown. Whoever sent that message knew I was here. They knew about the internal security involvement. That meant this wasn't just about Mark's petty crimes. He was a small cog in a much larger machine, and by pulling him out, I had inadvertently jammed the gears of a massive, dangerous organization. I reached my car, the only thing I had managed to keep in the wreckage of our life, and fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking so violently that I dropped them. As I knelt to retrieve them, the garage went silent. No cars arrived, no engines roared, no footsteps echoed. The silence was heavy, artificial, and suffocating. I jammed the key into the lock and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as a black sedan rounded the corner of the aisle, its headlights extinguished. I didn't start the engine. I slunk down, pressing my back against the upholstery, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sedan pulled up parallel to my car, blocking the exit. The tinted window of the driver's side rolled down an inch, but all I could see was the glint of a watch face, expensive, gold, and cold. A voice drifted through the gap, muffled but unmistakably clear. "He was a fool, Sarah. But you? You're an enthusiast. You've gone to a lot of trouble to dismantle our logistics. It would be a shame if your recovery ended prematurely." I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I pulled my phone out again, intending to call the emergency services, but the screen went dead. It wasn't just a loss of signal. The device had been remotely wiped. Every photo, every log, every piece of evidence I had spent weeks gathering. Gone. They weren't just watching me. They were inside my digital life. The sedan shifted, the engine revving once, a predatory growl in the quiet garage, before it slowly pulled away and accelerated toward the ramp, leaving me trembling in the dark. I knew I couldn't go home. If they could get into my phone and monitor my location, they were likely already inside my apartment, tossing the place for the backups I hadn't even realized I'd made. I needed to disappear, but I was tethered by my physical limitations. My leg was still healing, and I was in a city where I had no allies left. Mark had isolated us years ago, convincing me that his business associates were the only people who mattered. Now, I realized he had been protecting his network, not me. I drove until the city lights were a blur of orange and gray in my rearview mirror, heading toward the coast where I had once kept a small, dilapidated storage unit for my old art supplies. It was the only place I hadn't linked to Mark's life. As I navigated the winding roads, the rain began to fall, slicking the asphalt and making every curve feel like a gamble with my life. I was paranoid, checking every light behind me, watching for the black sedan, or anything that felt like it belonged to that world. When I finally pulled into the storage facility, the site was deserted, draped in the gloom of a flickering security light. I hobbled to my unit, my leg pulsing with sharp, hot stabs of pain. I opened the door, the rusted hinges shrieking in the night, and stepped inside. It smelled of turpentine and dust. I scrambled to the back, moving crates of old canvases, searching for the small lockbox I had hidden underneath the floorboards years ago. A box containing a burner phone and a set of keys to a cabin my grandfather had left me in the northern woods. I found the box, my fingers digging into the dust. I pried the lid open, desperate for the lifeline it offered. But as I pulled the burner phone out, I froze. The air in the unit changed. It felt ionized, charged with static. I slowly tilted my head, listening to the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside. They had followed me. I turned around, expecting to see the black sedan, but the entrance was empty. Then, I looked at the floor near the entrance. There was a single, fresh footprint in the dust, not mine. And sitting directly in the center of the unit, placed neatly on a crate I hadn't touched in years, was my own hospital chart. The one the nurses had kept at the foot of my bed, the one that supposedly never left the ward. Taped to the front of it was a single, pristine white envelope with my name written in a handwriting that sent a jolt of recognition through my soul. It was Mark's handwriting, but he was in custody. I reached out to touch the envelope, and as my fingers brushed the paper, the light above me exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging me into absolute, total darkness. From the shadows of the corner, a lighter flicked on, illuminating a face I hadn't seen in over a decade. The one person who was supposed to be dead. The flame danced on the wick of the lighter, casting long, erratic shadows that turned the storage unit into a cavern of horrors. The face illuminated in that brief, flickering glow wasn't a stranger's. It was my father's, a man who had been declared deceased in a plane crash 15 years ago. He looked older, hardened by lines that carved deep trenches into his skin, and his eyes were devoid of the warmth I remembered from childhood. He sat on an old folding chair, holding the lighter with a steady, practiced hand, his gaze fixed on me with a terrifying mixture of disappointment and calculation. "You always were the curious one, Sarah," he whispered, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot. "Just like your mother. You couldn't just let the accident be an accident, could you? You had to dig into the roots of the tree without realizing the poison that feeds it." I leaned against the wall, my crutches clattering to the concrete floor. My voice failed me. I could only stare, my mind reeling from the impossibility of it. "You're dead," I managed to choke out. "They held a service. I buried a casket for you." He let out a dry, humorless laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "A necessary performance for a necessary disappearance. The organization needed a clean break, and your mother, well, she wasn't as adaptable as I was. She didn't understand that to survive in this world, you don't just walk away. You have to weave yourself into the fabric of the shadows." He gestured to the folder on the crate, the one containing my medical records. "Mark wasn't the mastermind, Sarah. He was the janitor. He cleaned up the messes, handled the logistics, and kept his mouth shut. But you've caused a massive internal hemorrhage for people who don't tolerate mistakes. They wanted you gone the moment you accessed that drive. I'm the only reason you're still breathing." The betrayal hit harder than the car accident ever could. Everything I had been through, the isolation, the pain, the frantic hunt for justice, was just a puppet show played by someone I had mourned for half my life. "You let me believe you were gone," I hissed, my fear beginning to calcify into a cold, diamond-hard rage. "You let me suffer through everything, alone, while you were pulling the strings?" "I was protecting you from the truth," he countered, standing up slowly. His movements were fluid, predatory. But your meddling has brought the scrutiny of the Internal Security Service onto our doorstep. You think you ruined Mark? You've put a target on your own back that's too big to miss. They aren't going to arrest you, Sarah. They're going to erase you." He stepped closer, the lighter flame dying out, plunging us back into the suffocating dark. I could smell the faint scent of charcoal and something metallic, the smell of the illegal weapons he used to keep in the garage. "Come with me," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "Or stay here and wait for the people who are currently turning the corner into this facility. They aren't as sentimental as I am." I heard the distant rumble of a heavy engine approaching the facility. The security light outside suddenly died, plunging the entire parking lot into an abyss. My heart was a frantic drumbeat in my chest. If I stayed, I was facing people who wanted me silenced. If I went with him, I was walking into the lion's den, rejoining a man who had faked his own death and likely orchestrated the very circumstances that led to my life being destroyed. I reached out, my fingers brushing the handle of a metal tool I had kept on the workbench, something sharp and heavy. I didn't want his protection. I wanted my life back, even if it meant burning his world to the ground. "Why now?" I asked, my voice steadying. "Why show yourself now if you've been watching from the shadows all this time?" He stopped inches from me. In the darkness, I could feel his breath, cold and sharp. "Because," he whispered, "your mother left something behind that even the group doesn't know about, and you, my dear, are the only key to finding it. They think I have it, but they're wrong. You have it, hidden in a place you don't even remember." Before I could ask what he was talking about, the door of the storage unit was kicked inward with a violent force that sent the metal frame groaning. A beam of blinding tactical light cut through the gloom, hitting the back wall and sweeping across the room. A voice, amplified and aggressive, boomed from the darkness outside. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them! If you move, we will take the shot!" My father didn't flinch. He leaned in, his lips brushing against my ear, and whispered, "The choice isn't mine anymore, Sarah. It's yours. Either you run with me into the woods, or you step into that light and hope they believe you're a victim and not an accomplice." He reached into his coat and produced a small, silver object, sliding it into my palm. A key to a safe deposit box I had never seen before. "Choose carefully. The person standing in that doorway isn't who you think it is." The light swung toward us, catching the face of the man leading the raid. I looked up, and my blood turned to ice. It wasn't an agent of the security service. It was Mark, and he was holding a weapon that looked nothing like the ones he used for his pathetic street schemes. Mark stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh, artificial glare of the tactical lights. But the man who had checked himself out of the hospital, the one who had whined about the inconvenience of my injuries, was gone. This Mark stood with a rigid, unnatural posture, his face a mask of cold efficiency. He held the illegal weapon with the steady, practiced grip of a veteran, not the panicked fumble of an amateur. Behind him, 3 other figures shifted in the shadows, their movements synchronized and silent. They weren't police, and they weren't the Internal Security Service. They were something far more specialized. My father stiffened beside me, his hand tightening momentarily on my shoulder before he let go. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed disappointed. "I told you, Sarah," he muttered, almost to himself. "The janitor always knows where the trash is buried." Mark leveled the weapon at my father, his gaze never flickering toward me. "Drop the lighter, Elias. The game ended the moment you stepped back into the light. The group doesn't appreciate ghosts, especially ones that have been holding back assets for a decade." "Assets?" I spat the word out, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and fury. "I'm not an asset. I'm a human being." Mark finally looked at me, and his eyes were as hollow as an empty grave. There was no trace of the charm or the fake affection he had weaponized against me for years. "You were never just a partner, Sarah. You were the insurance policy. Elias kept you in the dark, kept you clean, because he knew that one day he'd need a leverage point that even the highest levels of the network couldn't touch. You think that accident was a mistake? It was a test. A way to see if you'd crumble or if you'd start hunting. You proved to be very resourceful. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The accident, the timing, the way Mark had always been distracted. It wasn't a reckless slip. It was a calculated move to force me into the light, to see if I could find the evidence my father had hidden. I was the key, just as my father had claimed, but I was being hunted by both sides of the same coin. My father stepped in front of me, shielding me from Mark's line of fire. "She doesn't know where it is, Mark. You're wasting your breath. Kill me, and that information dies with me. You'll never find the cache, and the group will have your head on a platter by morning." "I don't need you to tell me," Mark said, his tone chillingly casual. He signaled to the men behind him. They moved with predatory grace, circling us, cutting off any path to the exit. "We've spent the last hour sweeping your digital footprint, Sarah. We didn't just wipe your phone. We tracked the geolocation of every device you've owned since you were 10. We know about the cabin, we know about the bank, and we know exactly where your mother hid the final ledgers before she was dealt with." I looked down at the key my father had pressed into my hand. It was cold, heavy, and seemingly insignificant. If they knew everything, why was Mark still talking? Why hadn't they just ended it? Suddenly, the silence of the storage facility was shattered by a low, rhythmic pulsing, the sound of a high-frequency jamming device. The tactical lights on Mark's team flickered and died. For a few seconds, we were cast into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint red dots of laser sights dancing frantically on the walls. "Get down!" my father roared, shoving me behind a heavy steel cabinet. A cacophony of sound erupted, not the staccato bark of fire, but the sharp, muffled thwip-thwip of silenced rounds and the chaotic clatter of metal on concrete. I huddled in the fetal position, my hands over my head, my heart screaming in my ears. I heard Mark shout a command, followed by a grunt of pain that sounded wet and final. Then, a voice I didn't recognize, a woman's voice, cool and terrifyingly calm, spoke over the chaos, amplified by a loudspeaker from somewhere outside the building. "Cease fire! Secure the girl! Leave the bodies!" The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and burnt propellant. I peered out from behind the cabinet as the dust settled. The storage unit was a graveyard of broken crates and debris. Mark was on the floor, clutching his side, his weapons skittering toward me. My father was gone, vanished into the shadows of the rear exit, leaving only a trail of dark, viscous liquid leading into the night. I scrambled backward, but my leg, still weak from the pins, betrayed me. I fell hard against the wall. A pair of polished, black tactical boots came into view, stopping inches from my face. I looked up. The woman standing over me was wearing an unmarked tactical uniform, her face obscured by a sleek black visor. She reached down, her gloved hand gripping my chin with iron strength, forcing me to look at her. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you, Sarah?" she asked, her voice distorted by the comms gear. She reached out and snatched the key from my palm. She didn't look at it. She looked at me with a terrifying, hollow intensity. "You think you've been running from your father or your husband, but you haven't even met the people who actually own this city." She leaned closer, and the visor lifted, revealing a scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a mark I recognized from a grainy childhood photo of my mother. "And the worst part is," she whispered, "you're going to thank me when I show you the rest of the file." She tapped her earpiece, and the wall of the storage unit began to groan. A massive, heavy armored vehicle was reversing into the bay, its headlights washing over the scene and illuminating something hidden beneath the floorboards that my father had desperately tried to protect. As the floor cracked open, I saw what was underneath, and the horror of it froze my blood completely. It wasn't money. It wasn't evidence. It was a set of blueprints, and they were labeled with my own name and a date. Tomorrow. The blueprints weren't just designs. They were architectural schematics for a life I hadn't lived yet. Every room, every transition, every coincidence that had brought me to this exact moment was laid out in meticulous, clinical detail. I wasn't just a daughter or a spouse. I was a controlled variable in a long-term behavioral experiment. The woman standing before me, with my mother's scar and a face carved by the same cold logic that had defined my father's existence, held the key to the final chamber. "You were the blueprint, Sarah," she said, her voice devoid of malice, which made it all the more terrifying. "From the moment you were born, you were groomed to be the vessel for the information that could either stabilize or collapse the network. Every tragedy, every loss, every moment of revenge you thought you orchestrated, it was all simulated, triggered, and monitored. Mark wasn't your husband, he was your handler. Your father wasn't a runaway, he was your overseer." I looked at the blueprints, seeing the dates marked in red ink, dates that matched the deaths of my parents, the day of my accident, and even the day I had planned to file for divorce. My life had been a meticulously curated lie. The rage that had fueled me for weeks evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. If I was a variable, I was a variable that could still choose its own trajectory. "And now?" I whispered, my voice echoing in the hollow space of the storage unit. "Now," she said, pulling a secondary device from her belt, a small, handheld EMP generator. "We delete the data. All of it. The group is already tearing itself apart because you leaked their logistics. They think you have the master files. They think the blueprints are the weapon. I'm giving you the choice I never had. Walk out of here, leave the key, and let us burn the facility to the ground with everything inside. You'll be a ghost. No record, no history, no network." I looked at Mark, who was struggling to breathe on the concrete floor, his tactical gear failing him, his own masters already signaling for his extraction to be abandoned. I looked at the dark opening in the floor, the repository of a lifetime of manipulation. I realized then that my revenge wasn't about destroying them, it was about reclaiming the silence. "I don't want to disappear," I said, my voice gaining strength. I stood up, favoring my injured leg, refusing to let the pain define me anymore. I reached out and took the detonator from her hand. She smiled, a thin, ghost of an expression. "Then do it. But remember, Sarah, once you burn the bridge, you have nowhere to go back to." I didn't hesitate. I pressed the trigger. The explosion wasn't deafening. It was a low, resonant thrum that shook the very foundations of the building. The storage facility groaned as the support beams buckled, the fire suppression system erupting in a cascade of foam and water that smothered everything in white, sterile death. The woman didn't move. She simply turned and dissolved into the darkness of the parking lot, leaving me alone in the chaos. I walked out of the wreckage as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Real police, not the tactical ghosts of the network. I didn't look back at the flames, nor did I look for my father, who was likely already melting into the shadows of another city. I walked until my feet ached, until the crutches felt like unnecessary baggage, and until I reached the edge of the industrial district, where the city lights finally gave way to the quiet, dark expanse of the highway. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, silver key I had swiped from the woman's belt during our brief interaction. It wasn't the key to a safe deposit box. It was a master override for the network's internal server, the very thing they had been trying to keep me away from. I didn't use it to access their files. I didn't use it to blackmail them. I walked to the edge of the bridge, overlooking the dark river, and, with a flick of my wrist, sent the key spinning into the black water below. The next morning, I woke up in a motel 3 towns over. My leg was still stiff, the scar on my hip a reminder of the accident, but the air felt different. I checked my phone, a cheap burner model I'd bought with cash, and saw the news. A massive industrial fire at a storage facility had leveled a suspected front for an international organized crime syndicate. No survivors were reported. No arrests were made. The names associated with the site had been scrubbed from every database, as if they had never existed. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunrise over a horizon that finally looked empty. I had lost everything: my husband, my family, my identity, and my sense of safety. But as the sun touched the glass, I realized I had gained the one thing Mark and my father could never have: a blank page. I left the motel without looking at the mirror. I didn't know who I was going to be, but for the first time in my life, the story was mine to write, and I was going to make sure the ending was something they could never, ever predict. The vacation was officially over, and for the first time, I was truly free.